Recorded.
Hello, everyone who has joined us today. As Sarah mentioned, I am the Chief Park Ranger at the Soo Locks. I've worked there since 2009, and this is, I think, my 12th season of watching and photographing and learning about our winter work process. So with that, I'd like to mention a lot of people have come to see us on Engineers Day, and that is the one day of the year that people are allowed onto our facility at the Soo Locks. But unlike Engineers Day, I'm going to take you to a lot of places you cannot see on Engineers Day, and you can only see one time a year, which is during our winter work season. I'll run over some real quick geography and terms. Right here you can see a photo of the entire locks part of our facility from a helicopter. And these parts indicated by the arrow are what we call the canal or the approaches. These are parts of the river, upper and lower, that are just outside of the forebays and canal and chamber. The arrow is showing you the forebays. I'm going to be mentioning the forebays. Those are areas within the lock. And the lock gates, of course, kind of define the dimensions of that chamber. And of course the chamber, which is where the boats are and where we raise and lower the water levels. I'm also going to be talking about the guard gates, which are just below the forebays, and that is where we use those gates as a temporary dam during winter work. And of course, many of you, if you are boat nerds like myself or followers of the Soo Locks, will know that we get our last boat January 15th. As the official close. The actual last boat is usually a Coast Guard cutter, and this year we actually had 3 last boats in our final lockage, which included our own tug, a Coast Guard cutter, and the Sam Loud. Once the last boat goes through, that's when we start what we call dewatering. The inclination is to call this draining, but it is technically not draining, because to drain you're using gravity. And of course, we're having to take the lock chamber below the level of the lower river, so we cannot drain it, because unless you're at the mystery spot, water does not flow uphill. And this is an old picture of setting stop logs, but I can't bear to take it out of the program. We use a different setup now, but this is just such a great picture and so striking that I like to leave it in. The first task that we do once the last boats have cleared is we place a bridge over the chamber, approximately where that arrow is, which helps us get heavy equipment where we need it without having to barge everything. And of course, once the lock is closed, we can't use anything, bring anything into the chamber with a barge. Here the guys are waiting to hook it up to the heavy lift crane. And of course, before they can actually lift the bridge, of course, because it's winter and it's Sault Ste. Marie, there's a whole lot of shoveling to do. And over on the right-hand side, you can see a fellow using a propane torch. He's having to thaw the bridge off of the temporary anchorage where it sits during the summer. And I will mention too, if you visit us during the summer, you'll see this bridge sitting alongside the lock. The bridge weighs just shy of 70 tons when it's partially assembled, which is how they place it so that they can lift it with that barge. And sometimes, even though we've got that heavy lift crane, it needs a little bit of a nudge. So here you see the guys giving it a little bit of a nudge so that it can land exactly correctly on the anchors. When the bridge is set, a small crew stays to finish the assembly of that and get it ready so we can take heavy equipment across it. And then the whole operation moves upstream. So it's going to move over into that upper forebay area. And that is where we set the stop logs. If you visit us in the summer, you'll see stacks of these stop logs. I think technically they're called bulkheads, but we all just call them stop logs or logs. And these logs are lowered one by one, and they're stacked up to create a temporary dam. The logs are 110 feet wide because, of course, they have to span the entire width of the pole lock. Each log weighs about 93,000 pounds, and they fit into slots in the wall, which you can see kind of right here by these guys' feet. And then these orange things are little guides that help them slide down into that and hold their position correctly. Once they get it into that slot, here we have the radio operator who is communicating with the crane operator has set a weight on top of the log, which you can see right here, and he's holding a sounding line, which is marked with knots. And there is a man on the other side doing basically the same thing, and they are measuring as the log is dropping how deep it is in the water, because they have to make sure that it is sinking completely level, because of course if it ends up tipped to a side, we're going to end up with it wedged in there, which is going to be a bit of a problem. Over to the side, there's another fella who is holding this line here, and that is attached to the hooks that are on the lifting bar. Once the log drops and is stacked on top of the other log, of course they're able to release those hooks, but we need to pull them free so that they don't snag on anything else, and they can get them that lifting bar out of the water and ready for the next log as quickly as possible. Each log probably takes between 45 minutes and an hour to set, from dropping the last one and swinging the crane over to pick up the next one. And this year this process went well on into dark, and yes, it was very, very cold. Also, at the other end of the lock, a little earlier in the day, we had a crew getting those guard gates ready for the dam at the lower end. We can't close these until the logs are in place, but they usually like to get them ready early just so they have time to deal with any issues if there are any snags. Keep in mind, these gates are about 53 years old, and they only move once a year. Well, I should say twice a year. They move once to create the temporary dam, and then they move back to start the navigation season. These are unpowered gates, so we're actually using our tugboats to push them into position, and the tugboats will actually hold them into place while we wait for the water level on the upstream side to drop, because it's actually the head of water against the gates that's going to hold them shut. Down in the basement, a man, when everything is ready and the guard gates are in place and the last logs are all in, he opens the final valve, which allows the water to flow from the lock chamber into a deep well, which basically works like a sump pump in your house, only much bigger. We use 5 pumps. You can see them in these photos. The ones up here, these are from 1914. They're 300 horsepower pumps. And these ones are a little newer. I think they're from the 60s. And these are 350 horsepower pumps. And these use a 5-foot discharge. There's 2 5-foot discharge pipes to move the water out. So we're moving a lot of water, but it still takes us 16 to 20 hours to remove the last 30 feet of water out of that lock chamber. I should mention that the logs, the stop logs, and the guard gates are not 100% watertight. So we actually use divers who go into the water, and they make sure to chink up any leaks that they can see from flowing through those gates. And I will point out the flag you see up here. The wind was whipping. It was freezing cold. The water was about 35 degrees. And I can tell you that the diver here, he is the most comfortable guy on this entire job, because this cord, which carries all his communications and oxygen, is also carrying hot water to his suit. So he is working in what is basically a personal jacuzzi there, about 30 feet underwater. And meanwhile, his tenders are standing out in the cold, monitoring his lines and making sure he has the equipment and tools that he needs. Part of the equipment he's using for this job is oakum, and this is a fibrous material that they use, and they jam that into all the cracks that they find, and it slows and stops the flow of water through the gates. And eventually we have an empty lock, and the winter work projects can get started. This is a picture from 2018, and I will probably never take it out of this presentation. It's one of the favorite pictures I've ever taken. And it's kind of nice too, you can see some of the features in the lock. These are the outlet ports, so when we're changing the water level in the chamber and dropping it down to Lake Huron level, these openings over here are where the water is flowing out of. There's culverts that run through the lock wall, which we'll see a bit later. These are our lower operating gates. We have 2 sets of them. Up here into the wall are our upper operating gates. And here you can see those stop logs that I mentioned that stack one on top of another to form the temporary dam. So roughly 60 feet over his head is the Lake Superior water level in front of this gentleman who is kind enough to pose for this picture for me. Then they start the lock layup procedure, and this has to happen every time we dewater the lock, especially in winter. Here they're opening the manhole covers because there are manhole covers that lead to the drainage systems that are below the lock. And they have to get these manhole covers up before they freeze. And they wedge them so that they can lift and move and put them back when it's time. They have to open all the valves to keep the water moving towards the deep well and the pumps. Point out just briefly how big this wrench is that they have to stand there and spin until that valve is open all the way. At our place, engineers get a lot of credit for problem solving, but I always like to point out that the actual worker guys, sometimes I call them the hammer swinger guys, they are incredibly great problem solvers. I had walked down with them to get these photos of them doing lock layup just this year, and there are small holes in that manhole cover, but there was, because of all the water over it and the water going in, there was a great deal of suction, and even with the three of them and a crowbar, they could not budge that manhole cover because of the pressure of that suction. And they just on the spot figured out, you know what, let's get some garden hose and we'll break the suction. So they stuck some sections of garden hose through those little holes, which created enough of a break in the suction that they were able to easily pry this off. I lost my mouse just a second. There we go. Also, that big wrench I pointed out, it had gone missing this year. And it takes a lot of turns even with the big wrench. And with this little wrench, it was getting pretty ridiculous. So they solved the problem on the spot, used these, made a lever, and they just kind of were able to walk it open. Another part that happens during lock layup and getting ready for winter work is we have to get all the equipment positioned. Everything on the lock floor is, of course, below ground level, 30 to 60 feet, depending on if you're in the upper or lower part of the lock. And all of the equipment has to be brought down and eventually brought back out again. Here they are installing blocks below the reverse tainter valve. For winter, they put the valves in a partially raised position, and then they use these big oak timbers to brace that valve up, because if they don't, eventually that's going to, all that water that they're standing in is going to freeze. And if the valve is frozen to the floor, it's going to be impossible to get our business back running. Just to point out the culvers where these valves are, this is a picture from 1967, the construction of the Polock. And right here is the south culvert, and over here is the north culvert. These are the passageways that the water flows out of and in and through. If they come in through the upper end, it flows out to the bottom end through those outlet ports I pointed out before. And just to get an idea of the scale of these culverts and how using gravity we can move so much water so quickly, I like to point out this dump truck compared to the openings in this culvert. Here they're putting up windscreens. These are the inlet ports. We pointed out the outlet ports earlier. The inlet ports are at the upper end. They have those grating sections over them to keep debris from washing into the culvert. It's not 100%, but it works pretty well. And they're putting windscreens up so that that does not become a wind tunnel. The ice is going to freeze, or the water is going to freeze in there, but having wind whipping through there is going to make it a lot worse. And unfortunately, this is as close as I can get for photos in the upper end, because I don't have the fall protection training and gear that I would need to safely access that area. Some tasks in the winter are probably like they are at your house. They're more or less nonstop, like dealing with ice and snow. So they do regular things like plowing and snow blowing. I'll mention that we have probably miles of cart paths and walkways all over the facility that have to be maintained. And if you're from the Soo, you'll know it snows a lot here. And if you're not from the Soo, I can tell you it snows a lot here. And of course, there's a lot of shoveling to do. And the crews also have some unique contraptions we use to deal with ice and snow. These are steam pans. So this is hooked up to a steam line, and these can be hung wherever we need them, like on the gates, to use steam to remove ice from the lock walls and the lock gates. We also use steam lines and steam pans to get rid of big piles of ice and snow which accumulate. We also do plow work areas with the bobcats to create work spaces, and then we end up with these gigantic snowbanks just like you would see at your local supermarket at the end of winter. And we can't open the lock with these projecting up above the sills, so we use tarps and steam lines and steam pans to get them melted before we re-water the lock. And of course we use sledgehammers and pickaxes to remove ice from the gates. And of course we have to do this to create safe workspaces for anyone who's going to be working below. And as you can see, we're doing this several stories up. And that is, as I mentioned, is to create a safe workspace. You can imagine if you were trying to work below this and an icicle like that dropped off, well, it would be deadly. So some of the activities that go on every year are cleanup and drain crew. These vary from year to year. These are some pictures right now from 2020. This area is normally not accessible because we use those guard gates that I pointed out for the temporary dam at the lower end. But in 2020, we had to do some work on those gates. So we put stop logs in, and that gave our crews a really valuable opportunity to do a deep clean of this area to remove the debris. Normally this is done with a crane barge, but you can get to a lot more places and see what you're doing a lot better with an empty area and a bobcat. I will point out that rank has its privileges. This is our senior chief lockmaster. He's the guy with the most seniority in terms of lockmasters, and he's the guy in the bobcat. He is not the guy standing in the muddy, wet, cold water all day. And I also take an opportunity to point out in this picture, you see those rocks in that skip. Those are huge, and people are always wondering how those get in there. They come in with the propeller wash from the freighters, which is really stunning to think about how powerful those freighters are when you look at the size of some of those rocks. I think that one in the back is probably about as big as my dining room table. All of those loaded skips have to be lifted out. Each skip holds just over 6,000 pounds, and in 2020 this crew moved 600,000 pounds of rock from that lower approach area. And while the bobcat did the heavy lifting and the crane, workers actually comes down to shovels and rakes and implements of destruction for the last bits. And here one of my coworkers, Josh, is removing rocks from inside the recesses of those guard gates, a shovelful at a time. The other part of cleanup is, of course, the drain crew. And if you watch Dirty Jobs, this is one of the jobs that Mike Rowe did. And it is probably one of the dirtiest jobs at the Soo Locks. And as you may be aware, it is also called mucking. A designated drain crew has this job every year, and it is usually the lowest ranked of the chief lockmasters. So the lockmaster with the least amount of seniority is usually the guy who's running the drain crew. And every year they focus on different areas. Most years they try to do the entire lock that you see there. So they'll start in the upper, this is the lower forebay. They'll start in the lower forebay and work their way up, or they'll start in the upper forebay and work their way down. And almost by every other year, the entire lock has been thoroughly cleaned. Some years, if the weather is cooperative, they get the entire lock done. But as I mentioned, they focus on different areas each year. This year they were focusing on, I'll back up here again, they were focusing on this area. So they were doing the forebay area of the Poe lock and the forebay area of the MacArthur lock, and then they're going to be doing some work in the deep well. They have to do that, of course, they have to go into spaces below the forebay floor. So even once we have that empty lock and you're standing at the bottom, there's still more underneath you. And here they have to wear fall protection because inside that space, it's about the size of a medium-sized, good-sized room. There is a huge floor opening, which is where all of the water is draining out. to go into that deep well. And of course, that is a dangerous task until they get the railings put up around it. So the first guys going in there, this one is one of our lockmasters, and they are hooked up with fall protection gear until they get it barricaded off in a safe workspace. And then the hard work begins. Some years we use a big, huge, like commercial vacuum on a big trailer. And this year, though, we were just using shovels because it was not too bad and we didn't have the equipment down there. And I will say it's a miserable job and these guys are working hard, but compared to some of the other places to work within the lock in the winter, it's fairly comfortable. You'll see he's in his shirt sleeves. This is a heated space. This year, because there was so much snow up top, there's little openings above this room where water can flow in, but because of the ice and snow, there really wasn't anything dripping down. It was, once you got used to the smell, it was pretty comfortable. Once they they shovel it up, they take it in the wheelbarrow, they drop it into these red buckets, and these red buckets are lifted out one at a time. They are transferred into a bobcat, transferred into a skip, and then lifted out of the lock. This is not a bad operation in the Po. It goes pretty quickly and smoothly, and everybody's doing their part. It's not as pleasant in the bottom of the MacArthur lock. This area had not been done since 2009, so you can see there's a pretty good mound of debris in there. This is actually an area that is featured, I think, in that episode of Dirty Jobs. And as you can see, the water is a couple inches deep. It's even deeper in some spots. And there's water dripping down. There was water dripping constantly down from the roof or the ceiling of this particular space. And I will confess that I got very good at finding little piles of debris to stand on while I was down here taking the pictures. This one is also worse because it's a lot slower. So once they get that bucket filled, it's got to be lifted. But we didn't have a crane in the bottom of the Mac lock this year, so it has a very long lift to get up to the surface. So the guys don't have much to do but wait and consolidate the piles of debris until they get the next bucket back and can start filling that one up. About 99% of what we find is sand, rocks, and sticks, sometimes a little bit of taconite, and the occasional tool. A couple of the treasures, though, that they found this year were a fork in the MacArthur lock, and they found this little bracelet in the Po lock area. Once the forebays are done in a regular year, they move on to the laterals in the lock chamber. These are the openings here, which the water flows up into or out of when we're locking boats. This year they're working on the deep well area, and that is another area featured in the Dirty Jobs episode. And that is an area I do not have the training or, to be honest, the inclination to go. So I am not able to get down there to get photos of that. But I'm going to go ahead and describe the process that we use when we're doing the laterals, because that is something we normally do. This is a view from the chamber of the lock looking up, so looking upstream. Here you see that sill that's at the western edge at the upper end of the Po lock, and here you see those stop logs that are forming the temporary dam. This is that big commercial vacuum that we use. And the laterals are where you see these kind of breaks in the snow. So those are the openings. I think these pictures are all from 2020. The crew here, they are inside those laterals, and they are placing steam lines because on the floor of these laterals are manhole covers that they have to lift up to access the below lock drain systems. And these are the little openings that the water flows out of. And there's a fella standing next to one of those laterals, and standing next to, I should say, the opening in the lateral. And in 2020, we were replacing some sills in the Po lock, and there was some other work going on that the crew was unable to access this area through the lock chamber, and they actually had to go through those culverts that I showed you earlier. So they have to walk through. It's completely black, slick and dark, and they have to kind of like walrus scoot themselves out of these little openings. The day I was there, it was pretty cold, so it was frozen and snowy, so it wasn't too bad. But it can be quite miserable when it's muddy and wet, and that's how you start out your workday, is climbing through all that icy cold water to get started. I don't have a total from 2020, but in 2019, the crew removed about 15 tons of debris from the drains in the laterals. Um, this is another job at the Soo Locks that is pretty much a nonstop job. This actually goes on year round. You may well see crews working on this if you visit us in the summer, but in the winter it becomes the task of one of the chief lockmasters and his crew. And we have miles of piers at the Soo Locks, and the pier walls and the approaches and on the lock gates are all covered in these things we call Fender Timbers. These are big oak timbers, and put on there as like rails. And ships actually do rub up against them as they're coming in, which helps protect the ship and protects the lock wall. This year, they are so far not doing Fender Timbers this year. This year, because of the work in the deep well, everybody is on the mucking crew. But I have some pictures from the past that I'll show you. Sometimes this process, if we have a cold snap, starts out with having to use propane torches to thaw out the timbers so that we can drill them. And this is another task where you're going to want to measure twice, cut once. And they're drilling holes that will line up with the brackets and the holes on the pier walls. When they're ready, they're lowered into place using this crane. And then once they're in place, they drive the irons in. So they're pinning them to the supports that are built into the lock wall. And I will say, of all of the winter work jobs, this is probably the only task that is a bit harder when the weather is nice. Because when the weather is nice, of course, the river is not frozen quite as deeply or thickly as you might like, and they have to work from a scaffold. So when they're working from the scaffold, you're limited to 2 guys. And every time they finish a section, like you see here, then of course they have to pick up the scaffold, pull up its anchorages, re-anchor it to the new spot, and then start over again. In the winter, when the river is frozen, you can work right on the river. You can just keep walking down. You have a little more space to move around. And it's probably the only task that is easier when it is bitter cold. During winter work and during the winter season, depending on what our vessel maintenance schedule is, we also use the lock as a dry dock. So we'll have our various barges, whatever one is due for work or an inspection, and it will just ride down as the water level is lowered in the lock. And this has an advantage if not only do we get to inspect and work on that hull, it gives us a crane on the lock floor. So we just have more equipment to work with. Last year we dry docked the barge Huron, and that one had a hull inspection. We did some sandblasting on it to get it down to bare metal and recoat it, and of course also to do some welding. Here he's installing some new rub rails. At least every 5 years, each lock gets a full physical inspection with a team of maintenance workers and engineers. They evaluate the condition of the lock, they plan future projects, and they identify problems. There's an inspection to some point every single year, but for the 5-year one, it is much more in-depth with a much bigger team of evaluators. One of the kind of tasks that they identify and plan then is replacing the sills in the locks. And so what are the sills? This is a picture of the MacArthur lock from 2000, I don't remember. It was a really nice winter. We had some mild weather, and here you can see the sills. The sills are these little raised portions you see in the nearly empty lock, and the gates rest against those. So almost like a door sill in your house, it's going to be what's right behind that gate and holds it shut. And the sill work actually starts with a survey. Before they do anything to the existing sill, they document the exact elevation and location of the sill. And this survey is done over and over throughout various points of the survey of the project to make sure that everything is where it is supposed to be. because if that sill is off even an inch, it could cause the gates to not close or seal properly, which of course means we are unable to operate the lock. This year we replaced the lower sill in the MacArthur lock. This lock, or I should say this sill, had never been replaced since it was originally poured in 1943. And this started with some contractors using diamond saws to score the old sill. And they followed that with a heavy-duty concrete saw to cut it off in manageable chunks, which were then lifted out of the lock. And then our guys started installing the forms. I'm cheating here a little bit. These are some pictures from 2020 because I was not there the day they installed those forms. And they use a telehandler because, of course, these form pieces are huge and heavy. So they use a telehandler to get them moved into position until they can be secured. Then they build a shelter over top of the entire sill because, of course, it's going to have a climate-controlled workspace. Here you can see the shelter nearly assembled, and you can see those forms. This is a picture from this year of that MacArthur lock sill. They're at the bottom of the lock, and them getting those forms in place and building the shelter around it. And then, of course, we have welders that come in, and they're going to weld the forms. And our guys are going to be installing rebar, a lot of rebar. This is actually a pretty comfortable workspace. It's well heated. You see the guys are not in their coats. It actually gets quite warm. This whole area has to be kept warm enough so that the concrete can be kept 55 degrees so it can cure properly. In Sault Ste. Marie, that can be a challenge. This morning when I went out for my morning run, it was -5 Fahrenheit. So winter work makes it a lot more difficult than doing this at another time of year. Again, we're working basically 60 feet below ground level. So everything is a process. And even bringing the concrete to the job site is a process. It starts out with concrete trucks on the surface who load their concrete into this hopper that you see there, and then it has to be lowered to the lock floor, and then it has to be emptied into another hopper right there, and that is on a telehandler, which then brings it over to the area where it is needed. This year they were really fortunate. It varies every year with the sill how they do this because of where they're able to position equipment. This year, they were able to take the back panels off of that shelter and bring the telehandler and that hopper right inside and put the concrete directly into place. Like most projects, we have a lot of heavy equipment and a lot of gear, and eventually it comes down to some skilled guys with hand tools. Another big project we're doing this year is gate coating. I asked a very smart engineer who's in charge of this particular project this year why it's called gate coating, and Alicia, the very talented engineer, explained that it is not paint, but a special coating here, USACE, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, exclusive marine-grade vinyl-based coating. And she described that it's a tough material that doesn't chip, scratch, or peel easily. It's slightly flexible. And this year we are doing the upper gates of the Polock, the upper operating gates. Each half of the gates, so you have the gates like this, each half is called a leaf. And each leaf is about 35 feet tall and 63 feet wide. It weighs about 134 tons. And just to reorient, right there in the arrow are the gates that we are recoating this year. This is a picture from 1968 when the Polock was nearly done. Here we see the gates from the upper end of the lock looking down. So you see the administration building there in the background. And they're building a scaffolding all around it, which gives them access and will provide a heated workspace and sheltered workspace. They had to remove all the extraneous stuff, like the Fender Timbers, and my apologies if you hear my dog. I bribed her with goodies, but apparently she has eaten them all. They have to remove grease lines, the Fender Timbers, the signal wiring, and even the walkway and handrails where this gentleman is standing right there. That is all going to have to come off. And then they're going to be sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. Then they're going to have this insulated wrap installed on them. This area has to be sheltered and heated so that the coatings can cure. As I mentioned this morning, that's a challenge in Sault Ste. Marie in the winter. This morning it was -5 Fahrenheit, so that would not allow a coating or paint to cure. Now I'm having to switch to some pictures from 2015. My apologies, but I don't have access to this area because, of course, that's going to require respirators and all sorts of gear I don't have. But it's the same process from these photos from 2015 doing the lower gates. As I mentioned, this has to be insulated and heated around the clock. This year to do the upper gates, they have 61 days total, and that includes building that scaffold, removing all the equipment, blasting the gates, recoating the gates, reinstalling everything, and removing the scaffold. To do this, the contractor is working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. To blast it, they have to get it down to bare metal, so they've got to remove all of the previous coatings and primers and etc., and get it down to bare metal so they can inspect and repair anything that they find that needs to be done. To do that this year, the contractors used 220 tons of abrasive, garnet-based abrasive, which is actually recyclable and neutral in terms of its impacts on the water and the facility. But most of it is gathered up and reused. Once they get it down to bare metal, they have to move quickly and get the primer on there. For the upper gates this year, they used 550 gallons of a zinc-based primer. And eventually they will have a big reveal. This was from, of course, 2015, but pretty soon we'll be having the big reveal on those upper gates, and we hope to see nice shiny black gates. And they'll be doing some touch-up. This again, a picture from 2015, but for the work they're doing this year right now, it's going to take more than 1,000 gallons of that marine grade vinyl coating to finish up that lock. And remember I mentioned they do the physical inspection every 5 years and a kind of quick one every year. That is to help identify projects for the next year and to plan even further out. When they did their inspection last year, they actually found a project that had to be addressed this year. So these are a picture. This is a picture of the lower operating gates on the pole lock, and what they found is under this area right here on the north leaf. So that's the north side, that half of the gate. This half right here. They found some aging concrete that was going to need to be dealt with. So that went into this year's work plan. And these gates, for a little bit of perspective, are 60 feet tall, 63 feet wide. They weigh about 225 tons apiece. And to do the work in that area over here, they're going to have to be lifted about 2 feet. Just another orientation there. So right there is the area we're talking about at the lower end of the pole lock. And to explain why this would be so important, I have a handy drawing that my son made for me. And this is showing this area in the pintle. So this is the pintle. The entire gate weight, that 225 tons, rests on top of that pintle. And then this pintle socket fits on top of it. And that is the pivot point for this 225 ton gate. And as I mentioned, they're going to have to lift this gate about 2 feet to get in there and do that work. And like most tasks in the winter at the Soo Locks, this is going to start with removing ice. So here they're using those pickaxes and sledgehammers to remove the ice overhead so that it's safe to work below. And then they're going to prepare the gates. And here they're using man lifts. They've got to install this roller bar, which is used to help stabilize the gate as it is raised vertically and as it's lowered when they're finished with the work. To do this lifting and lowering, they're going to use 3 200-ton hydraulic jacks, which you see right here in the yellow there. That's the jack. The jack operator is going to lift those gates 1/10 to 3/10 of an inch at a time. This is a very slow process to raise that gate that nearly 2 feet. And as he's doing that, the guys below are going to be taking constant measurements, and they're going to be building up and adjusting the cribbing that is helping support the gate around those jacks. Up top, they're going to be taking more measurements, and making sure that the gate is level and not moving in any way that they're not expecting. And every quarter inch that the gate goes up, they have to readjust the anchor points on the gate to hold it into place. I think it took them 2 days to finish the jacking of the gates. The next step is removing the old concrete. This was as close as I could get because, of course, I don't have the respirator and all of the other gear, and I also don't want to be in the way. Luckily, I have a pretty good zoom lens, and as you can probably imagine from that photo, this is a really small, miserable space to be trying to use a jackhammer. It's also not necessarily the best place to be installing the rebar, but our guys get in there and they get it done. Just for a little bit of perspective, right there you can see there's where they're working. So they are under that 225-ton gate in this tiny little area, getting everything ready. Just like the sill, the concrete has to be lowered to the lock floor, and we're using pretty much the same process with a telehandler and the 2 hoppers. But unlike the sill, they can't get that telehandler right in there. So they have this long tube and a guy on his hands and knees who is wrestling with that tube, directing it into place to get the concrete where it needs to be. And of course, back on your knees to get it all spread and worked into the places where it needs to be. And bent in half, reaching to get it finished, to get it smoothed out and completed. Again, the physical inspection parts and how important that can be. Sometimes in the physical inspection, they find things that need immediate action that cannot wait until the next year or the next cycle of major improvements or repairs. In 2020, they were inspecting the culvert, which is where these gentlemen are. They are standing in the culvert near the outlet ports where it empties into that forebay area. Right there in that area, they found some missing concrete in the north culvert. Approximately there, it's about 200 feet in from the forebay, behind where the lower valve is. Here's, oops. Oh, lost my spot. So again, we're working in the culverts on this north side, and so it's about 200 feet past the forebay area where they have to go and repair this concrete. Here's one of the chunks that was their first indicator that there was a problem somewhere within the culvert. This is one of the chunks that was found. This chunk is about 2 feet by 3 feet and maybe about 18 inches high. It was a kind of a drop in the bucket compared to what was missing. I didn't get any pictures before they had started the work, but one of the lockmasters provided this one for me. And here you can see they're installing the rebar. They've removed with jackhammers all of the loose concrete that they needed to, and they're getting ready to replace with the new. Another thing to note, remember that not only now are we working 60 feet below the surface, we're also working 200 feet within the lock. So not only do all of the equipment, supplies, scaffolding, tools have to be lowered to the lock floor, the guys are then having to basically hand carry it through that culvert to get it to the work site. And for the electrical lines, which you see over here, those all had to be dropped down through the valve from the surface to provide the power. They cut out custom sheets of steel to use as the forms. This was a case of, you've heard measure twice, cut once. This was probably measure more like 3 or 4 times and cut once. The holes had to be drilled in our machine shop, which was about a quarter mile away, and of course 60 feet up, 200 feet past the work area. So it was pretty important that they did not want to have to send any of these back. And some of them needed some fine tuning, as you see here. One of my coworkers, Richie, is fine tuning that with a big wrench. And with the fine tuning they were able to do, they actually did not have to send any of the sheets back, and everything fit like it needed to. And you remember, everything's being dropped down 60 feet to the work area. And again, the concrete coming down in those hoppers. And this time it's getting loaded into one of these mechanized wagons. And if you watch the Dirty Jobs episode, you saw that these are not easy to operate. but I guess compared to hauling it in a bucket at a time, it's the next best thing. So they would load this mechanized wagon with the concrete and drive it the 200 feet to the area in the culvert where they needed to place the concrete. Once it got to that area, it was then transferred into 5-gallon buckets and passed kind of fire brigade style up the scaffold, and then placed in behind the forms to repair this. Here's a picture of the finished product, and this will probably last well past any of our careers now that it has been repaired. Finally, we're approaching the day when it's time, everything is done, and it's time to re-water the lock. I'm going to issue a disclaimer here. This is an old picture, and we don't re-water the lock quite in this way anymore. And also, I want to mention that before we even get to this point, a lot of work has to be done to get here. Of course, we have to lift all that equipment out that we lowered in. We've got to melt those snow piles. And another challenge sometimes is we have to, depending on the winter, we have to thaw out the stop logs. So these stop logs, as I mentioned, they're not 100% watertight even after the divers go in. So they can fill up with ice and they can end up almost welded together. Here you see a guy using a steam line inside that gate. This is a miserable job. He was the low man on the totem pole, you might say, in his crew. And that's how he got the job of climbing into this stop log and throwing out the chunks of ice and using a steam line to free it. This is, needless to say, a miserable job. On the other side, especially if we have a bad winter like we did in 2014, which is when this picture was taken, we have to get creative. And again, this is, I work with so many creative problem solvers. What happens typically in a really bad winter, those stop logs are made of steel. And of course, steel conducts the cold. And it's up against this fresh water. So that any cold air on the other side of that log, of course, is going to cause the water in contact with this log on the upstream side to freeze. And it forms face ice, which is like a crystal clear, just solid ice. And it can extend up to 4 feet out from this gate. And of course, that's also going to more or less weld these logs together and make them impossible to lift. And in 2014, they came up with this solution. We usually use just some air lines and circulate the water, and that's enough to melt it. In 2014, that wasn't cutting it. So they came up with this huge pipe, basically, with some holes in it, and they ran steam lines through it, and they kind of lowered it and operated almost like a hot knife, although much slower than a hot knife, to move that ice away from that wall. And as I mentioned, this is how we used to rewater the lock. I'm sorry that they don't do it this way anymore, because it was really exciting. Sometimes they'd send a cameraman out to film it. The structure around it would like shake and vibrate, and there was so much noise. And if the sun was the right way, you'd get rainbows, and it was just thunderous and loud and exciting. So much so that people would even come out from the offices to take pictures and videos. I'm pretty sure we have a picture of this old process of rewatering the lock on our YouTube channel for the Detroit district. But now with the new logs, we have a much slower and less exciting process. It was funny, the first year we did it this way, I'm usually like hanging around waiting, and I want to be there when they rewater the lock. And one of the guys on the crew came and says, "Hey, we're rewatering the lock." And I was really upset. I was like, "Oh no, I missed it." And I'm going to hurry up and get up there. And he's like, "You don't need to hurry." And I was like, well, he doesn't know what I need. And I jumped on a cart and I went racing up there. And then I was like, oh, you're right. I didn't need to hurry. This is a much gentler process and a much slower process. I think it took close to 24 hours to fill the lock this way. But one of the advantages, of course, is we don't need a crane to lift the logs. And it's probably safer for the workers, and of course it's a much gentler flow of water on and through the lock. Once the chamber and the forebay are full, they're ready to put the guard gates away. Again, as I mentioned, these are not powered gates, so we have to use a tugboat to push them into place. And some years this goes very smoothly. Other years, not so much. This again is the infamous 2014 season, and there was a lot of ice. This gate has to go into this space and lock against this wall so that it forms a completely flush surface on the lock wall so it doesn't interfere with shipping and create a hazard for navigation. And as you can see from the ice in that recess, that gate is not going in that recess. And the boat hooks just were not cutting it to get that ice moving. So they ended up bringing out the big guns. In this case, that was actually a 4-inch compressed air line, which is what this man's holding right there. And with that, they were able to blast the ice, break up some of the bigger pieces, and kind of coax it out of the recess. And then they were able to finish it up with the boat hooks and secure the gate to the wall and have us back in business. The big fuss every year, if you're aware, we have a big hoopla for the first day of shipping, and everyone comes to see that first lockage. But the actual first lockage is usually icebreakers, and usually the icebreaker Mackinac, other than our tugs and barges. And the Mackinac has to go through before shipping starts because it's got to make tracks in Whitefish Bay, or there won't be any shipping coming downbound or upbound. Some years they're all lined up and waiting for midnight. This is a picture from 2016. In the 12 years that I've worked here, we have never been late opening the lock. And I'm not aware of when we have been late opening the lock. We've had years where we opened the lock and there were no boats because of weather, but we have always opened on time. Last year, we actually opened 12 hours early. We opened on noon on the 24th, and this is the first boat of the season, the Joseph H. Thompson, who made the first ceremonial lockage. There's no indication that's going to happen again this year, but it's a fun event to attend, whether it is at noon on the 24th or midnight on the 25th. If it's at midnight, we have special hours in the park from 11:30 until about 1:30, I think, and we let visitors into the park and into the platform to watch and greet that first ship that's coming through. On the first day of shipping, we also have an open house in our visitor center. Our visitor center is normally closed until Mother's Day, but we have a special open house in the visitor center from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. on that first day of shipping, and it's currently scheduled for our traditional opening of March 25th, and I would recommend that you watch Facebook for updates on that. And with that, I think I've covered everything, the major projects we're doing this year, some of the typical projects we normally do in the winter, and I will turn it over to Sarah and stand by to answer questions.
Okay, I was talking, but I was on mute. Thanks, Michelle, for that program. It was very educational, informational, and kind of amazing to see the amount of work that takes place over there. I just wanted to go through a couple of things about our visitor centers, and then we will get to the question part. Our visitor center here in Duluth is currently on our winter hours. For a couple more weeks, we're open Friday, Saturday, Sunday from 10 a.m. until 4:30 p.m. Starting on March 20th, we'll be open Thursday through Monday from 10 a.m. until 4:30 p.m. We do still have our cell phone tours available outdoors and a virtual online tour of the visitor center, as well as an online gift shop. At the Soo Locks, like Michelle just said, they will be having an open house on March 25th from 9 a.m. until 3 p.m. Their park is open from 9 a.m. until 6 p.m. every day. They've got online exhibits and information sheets, and their reopening of their visitor center will be on May 8th of this year. And we will continue to be open as long as we can comply with state and federal guidance and local health conditions. And then the last slide I have is just some information. Our various social media links are up there, as well as vessel schedule information You can contact us through the Hello LS MVC Gmail address if you are interested in being put on our mailing list to get information about these upcoming programs and other programs that we're doing. And I sent a link to the survey through the chat if you have a few minutes to do that. We take that information and plan our future programs, and provides us valuable feedback, which we appreciate. And then there's also a link for the YouTube channel, the district's YouTube channel. And I'm going to put that in the chat right now, and that is to find this program, this recorded program, and all of our previous programs that have been recorded are all on that YouTube site. And let's see. And once that's ready, we will put links in our social media and let everyone know. And now we can move on to questions. I don't know if you wanted me to read these to you or if you
Go ahead,
wanna
because
listen.
I was not watching them as they came in.
Okay. So the first question was, how many cubic feet in total? And I think that was referring to the amount of water in the lock, I believe.
That is way more math than a historian like me can manage.
So a lot.
It's a lot, yeah, because within the chamber of the pole lock, to change the water level, and that's just from the gates to the gates, to change the water level 21 feet, that's 22 million gallons of water. And we're talking about even more water to empty the lock, because we have to go down 30 feet plus the debris pits, and also including those forebay areas, which are, I think, about 200 feet long apiece. So it's more than double the amount to change the water level, which is why it takes those 5 pumps with their 5-foot discharges up to 24 hours to get that water out.
Mm-hmm. All right, so a couple of comments about so many simple yet brilliant ways to solve problems. Very cool. The rocks are stunning, and I had no idea the freighters bring that type of quote-unquote trash, boulders, in. A lot of work. I've always wondered if they find phones, watches, sunglasses. Don't you have a funny story?
We did find a phone, and I cut it out of the presentation just because I was worried about time. But since I had it as a question, I think it was about 2 years ago, I got an email from a colleague at the Convention and Visitor Bureau, because a lot of people contact them looking for us. And someone had dropped their phone on Engineers Day into the pole lock while they were taking a picture, and they were hoping we could find it and send it back to them. And of course, I just kind of laughed and thought, yeah, like, we're going to find a phone in all of this during the mucking. And I'll be darned, they found the phone. They actually found the phone. Of course, it's destroyed, but the people, we sent it back to them, and they have a priceless souvenir now.
Nice. And another question, do they hire extra workers to do all this work, or are these just the regulars that work year round?
These are just the regulars that work year round. Some of the crews end up, because there's 4 crews in the lock operations end of things, but a lot of times they end up morphed together for projects, or they end up having maintenance workers. They end up kind of dispersed and rearranged during winter, but it is all our own people, other than contract projects like the gate coating, which is actually contractors. But otherwise, all of the work is done by our own regular full-time employees.
Okay, and then someone asked if the new lock will work the same way.
It will. There's some modifications to equipment that will be going into the new lock, but I can tell you that the last big innovation in how a lock actually operates at the Soo occurred in 1881. When the Wetzel lock was built, and that one filled from the floor. The previous locks had filled from sluices in the gates. And otherwise, the only real changes to how the locks operate has had to do with the equipment and machinery. It's all gravity, and water flows from Lake Superior to Lake Huron. and it's just the machinery we use to control that flow that changes.
Okay. A couple of kudos, bravo. This has been incredibly information loaded, and I truly have so much respect for all those who work these locks. Another great presentation, unbelievable amount of work done in a short time. And then when will work on the new lock begin again?
That'll start again in the spring.
Okay.
And I mean, to be honest, the work is going on now still. It's just not the work outside that you can see. Starting in the spring, they're going to finish up the dredging in the upper approach canal to bring that to the project depth. And I think next year and a little bit of a year after, contractor is going to be finishing the approach walls, because we had to put in new approach walls and guide walls around the bascule lift bridge, so that we have a safe route and we won't have boats hitting those bridges. That'll be starting in the spring, but there is a whole team of new lock engineers, project managers, and people who are working on finalizing the design, getting the contracts ready for the chamber work, which I think will also be starting sometime this summer. So they'll begin demolishing the Sabin lock, filling in the Davis lock, and getting that work site prepared to build the new one.
Okay. Another
and we'll
question.
And we'll have a program all about this in October. So join us again in October, and we'll have a whole update from somebody from that team. Sorry, Sarah.
Awesome. No problem. What's the most unique thing besides the phone that was found in the...
I thought that bracelet was pretty cool, but one of the things I think they found last year that to me was kind of mind-boggling, the big freighters have bow thrusters, which is basically a propeller in the bow of the vessel that can turn in either direction, and they use it to hold their bow in position as they're coming into the lock. I mean, they use it for other things, but that's what they use it for in the lock. And they have like these grid gate things, like covers over them, so that things don't get in and interfere with the propeller, like a big screen. And these are like huge, like you could stand in these openings probably. And they found one of the screens from a bow thruster. And that was when I was like, how do you lose that? But that was something we found either last year or the year before, which was pretty remarkable.
Crazy. So you mentioned that a couple of these things have like a 5-year maintenance schedule, or another area that wasn't cleaned since 2009. I'm assuming they've got a list of things that they do every year, and then another maybe schedule of other types of maintenance that they do every couple of years or something.
Yes.
Is that right?
And they'll schedule things like gate coating and replacing a sill and things like that. Those get scheduled years in advance, just because of the time that they take. Like we're only closed down for 10 weeks, and even that is not really 10 weeks by the time we get the lock laid up and by the time we get ready to rewater the lock. So we have such a short window of opportunity to do any kind of projects like that. I mean, that's why when I talked to Alicia, the engineer who's overseeing the gate coating contract, I mean, she knew we have 61 days because every single day is accounted for. And so projects like that, you don't just say, hey, let's just do this year. It's planned well in advance. And then, of course, as I mentioned, there are the projects where we find something and they end up getting jumped to the front of the list because it's something that can't be let go because we're going to start having a problem.
Have there ever been, since you've been working there, have there ever been cases where they've kind of pushed it up to the last minute to get the locks back open because of a surprise or project that they weren't expecting?
In the 12 years I've been here watching this, I've not ever seen where people are in a panic. I mean, there have been times where there was something on the list they were going to do this year, and then they may end up reevaluating and doing it next year because of something that took a little longer than they anticipated. but I have never in my time here seen where something had to go that was critical or that we have been panicked about opening on time.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that, our planning for winter work is almost like a constant, and they ramp up for each season probably around July. They start having meetings and they start figuring out equipment and figuring out how many people need to be on crews and what it's going to take to get the work done on time.
Mm-hmm.
So it has a lot to do with very careful, meticulous planning.
Mm-hmm. Wow. All right. Another question about the new lock. Do they still have an estimated finish date of 2027?
That is if all of the funding is consistent and which means steady. They say efficient funding, but they mean steady funding. If we keep getting our regular funding as we're requesting and needing, and we don't have any weather issues, which of course in the Soo, it's Michigan, it's northern Michigan, and you can't count on that. That is still a possibility. The official scheduled plan for opening the new lock is 2030. But as I mentioned, if everything goes according to plan and the weather cooperates and the funding is steady, then it will be 2027.
Okay. All right. I don't see any other questions at this time, but we can wait a minute or two in case anyone has any. You can stay on the program.
And I see someone commented that her son says 10 weeks feels like forever. And I can tell you from, my 2 hours standing underneath the MacArthur lock in 2 inches of cold water, sometimes 2 hours can feel like forever. I should have worn my waterproof boots that day.
Next time. Any hints of a name for the new lock?
It's going to be named by Congress. So when it's completed, that is when Congress will name the lock. So I have no idea. And it's way above all of our pay grades, as we say in the military.
Yeah. Okay.
I see someone asking if they enjoy the change of pace. I don't know about our maintenance guys because they work like regular shifts, but our lock and dam operators, the lock operations crews, they work during the navigation season, March 25th through January 15th. They work 12-hour shifts on like swing shifts. And I can't even keep track of what that schedule is. And it can be really hard if you have kids or a spouse you like to spend time with. And I think they do look forward to that 10 weeks of winter work because they're working either straight 8s or they're just working 10-hour days, the regular 5 days a week once they get past lock layup. Lock layup, that ends up turning into nonstop work until it's done. But I think they do enjoy the break. But I think then they're also eventually glad to be done with the hard work of the lock maintenance work and get back to the regular business of locking boats, which has its own challenges in the winter.
Another question, do all the locks have generally similar maintenance procedures? Or do they differ?
They do. Basically, as I mentioned, they all operate the same. There's some differences in how their culverts and laterals are laid out, but they all have to have pretty much the same work done. But the PO lock is prioritized. So the PO lock, which is our biggest lock and the only one that can handle the biggest of the Great Lakes freighters, that one is always job number 1, and that is always prioritized over work in the MacArthur lock, which would be why the MacArthur lock hasn't had the mucking done below its floor since 2009, because the PO lock is the most important. And then we don't do these kind of tasks in the Davis or Sabin locks because they are no longer in service. So they have, they're evaluated and monitored, but they mostly now work as water retention devices rather than as operating locks. So we don't spend the time doing these projects on those. And if things go as scheduled, they're both going to be destroyed this year. And yeah, the locks in the Seaway do go through a similar process. I have not been able to be there to see their winter work process, but navigation locks, other than differences in machinery and equipment, are basically all operating the same way. In the Seaway, the water is going, in the Welland Canal, the water is going from the Lake Erie level to the Lake Ontario level, and it's doing the same kind of gravity operated process, and they'd be doing very similar maintenance. I don't know what their dewatering schedule is on the Welland. They have 8 canals there, or 8 locks that they have to maintain. And then, of course, in the Seaway, it's the same going from Lake Ontario to the Atlantic Ocean level. And unfortunately, I'm busy here in the Soo in the winter documenting our winter work activities to do programs like this and for exhibits at the visitor center. So I have not been able to go and check out this process in Canada.
Sounds like a field trip opportunity.
It does. You want to come, Sarah?
Yes. I'd love to.
You know, I will admit I have gone to the Welland Canal on a couple vacations because I am a boat nerd.
All right. Well, it looks like we are at the end of the questions, and I don't see any more coming through. So I think we will be ending this program now. I sent a link to the YouTube channel where the recorded version will be posted once it's ready, probably a few days. And had a question trickle in here. Does the whole Seaway close at the same time?
I think that it does, and I think the Seaway closes pretty close to when we close. Although I think they open a little earlier than the Pollock does, but I don't have their dates like stamped into my brain like I do the Soo Locks dates.
Yeah, I think the
There it is. Don just told us they open on March 22nd, so they're a few days before us.
Yeah, and I thought the St. Lawrence Seaway closed to Salties like on Christmas.
That sounds about right because we usually
Yeah.
have the last salty sometime around then through the Soo Locks.
Okay. All right, everyone. Well, thank you again for participating today, and I hope you enjoyed it. And please join us on April 7th for our next program about vessel names and how they came to be. And I think that's about it. Everyone stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you in about a month. Thank you so much for being with us today. Take care.